This is Guns Unpacked, a podcast where we interrogate, engage, and elevate the terms of the gun debate as we know it. I am your host, Jennifer Carlson, the director of the Center for the Study of Guns in Society at Arizona State University. Today, we are welcoming Dr. Jesenia Pizarro, who is a professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University. Her research is transdisciplinary in nature and focuses on the proximal event and situational factors that result in violence, the processing of violent crime in the criminal justice system, and anti-violence strategies. Dr. Pizarro is a member of the Homicide Research Working Group, a board member of the Research Society for the Prevention of Firearm-Related Harms, an affiliate also of many initiatives on the ASU campus, including the Office of Gender-Based Violence, as well as our own Center for the Study of Guns in Society. She was also just elected president of the Research Society for the Prevention of Firearm-Related Harms. Her work has been funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, National Institute of Health, and the National Science Foundation, and she currently is serving as the editor-in-chief of the academic journal Homicide Studies. So welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to just start right off the bat with your leadership in the field of gun studies. So you were recently elected president of the Research Society for the Prevention of Firearm-Related Harms. And so first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
And many people, scholars, and just people out there probably have not heard of this society, partly because it's just very new. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us about what this society is and how you got engaged in it?
We are envisioning the society as a place to train and to nurture the next generation of firearm scholars. One of the things that have happened in the United States is that due to previous legislations, there was a pause in a lot of the federal funded research on firearm violence. And it wasn't until recently that the federal government, particularly the CDC, started back on that research agenda. So there is a lag of people that are doing this type of work. But another thing that we strive to do here is with the society, is to push forward the scientific inquiry of firearm-related violence and harm. It's one of the leading killers in the United States, and we want to make sure that we can inform policy and best approaches with rigorous scientific methods and not anecdotes or opinions.
The U.S. Surgeon General, we're recording this just very shortly after a statement on gun violence as a public health issue was just released. And I think some people read the statement or heard about the statement, saw coverage of the statement, and saw it as sort of like, okay, this is obvious. It's a public health issue. It involves people's lives and trauma and psychological well-being and all those things. And then other people read it and thought, this is politically incendiary, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's something very politically hot button about framing guns as a public health issue. And so I was wondering, you mentioned the CDC and you mentioned the Dickey Amendment, and you didn't say it by name, but
yes.
I'm guessing that's what
yes.
you meant. This idea of gun violence being a public health crisis, a public health emergency. This is a two-part question. One is why is this meeting such resistance? And also, do you think that this statement from the Surgeon General, do you think this is really signaling a sea tide shift? I don't know if that's the right word, a shift in how we're thinking about gun violence.
Yeah, so why do I think it's a hot topic and a hot issue? I think there's a lot of myth and anecdotes and scare tactics surrounding the discussion on gun violence in the United States. And some of those myths and anecdotes have to do with the fact that for the past prior to 2020, there was a pause in the research. So there was not a lot known. And in the United States, and one of the things that we have that's unlike other countries is the Second Amendment, right? It's part of our culture, it's part of the American fabric. I've heard many people say, that's my God-given right to have a gun. And it's part of who we are as Americans. And I think when there is a potential threat with lack of scientific evidence, with lack of actual real facts, people get a little bit ornery of oh my goodness, this is a right that was given to me by my founding fathers. And that's, just step back. That's one of the things we're trying to do with the society is bring light to a lot of those myths. Are these myths? Are these realities? And how can we better put forth science in a way that's not going to infringe on what we as Americans consider to be our rights. In terms of the tide shifting, I did start seeing the tide shift earlier on under the Obama administration, but I think it's important for us to realize that when you look at a list of what is causing the death of Americans, gun violence is up there. Gun injuries are the number one killers of children and teens. There are the number one killers of certain demographic groups and certain racial groups. So the fact that so many people are losing their lives to this is indicative that it is a public health concern because people are dying out there.
Yeah. So seatbelts and smoking often get used as examples when we are talking about public health approaches. And, even in the coverage of the Surgeon General statement, there's a lot of discussion about gun violence. We can think of it as, we can approach it like we approach traffic accidents and smoking. And, just to make it super concrete when we're talking about guns as a public health issue. So one way of going about that is to say, it's a public health issue because as we've just been saying, it impacts lives, health. It's operating on that level. But there's also this kind of more subtler way that we can think about it as a public health issue, which is that as some of the work that you've done, gun violence, we can understand it, whether it's through the metaphor of infectious disease. And so you've done work specifically on how we can think about it productively as an infectious disease. And I think some people might be like, wait, that really doesn't make sense to me. What does that actually mean? And so can you tell us, what does that actually mean? And not just what it means, but how does that illuminate both the determinants, the factors that cause homicide, but also open the door to sort of imagining different kinds of solutions to the problem of homicides?
Of homicides or gun violence?
Well, I think either way.
Either way.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to answer this question in two ways. From the firearm violence perspective, right? When we talk about treating gun injury and gun violence as a public health concern, it also opens the door for funding, but not funding to take away people's guns, but for funding for us to understand what are the mechanisms that lead to that violence so that you could put prevention methods in place and use the public health framework to use prevention such as primary prevention efforts. Perhaps what we need to do is do better education in our community so that people understand the lethality of the weapon or things like that, right? I like to think about homicide, and I don't think some people think about it, is that homicide is usually an outcome of a violent event, and that it's not unitary, and that there's different types of homicides. When we looked at homicides as an infectious disease, we were particularly interested in looking at gang violence. And what we found is that the culture that leads to people subscribing to gang ideology, it spread, but it was spread through communication with people, with interaction between gang members and people in those communities. And as a result of that, you will have gang incidents. And through the interaction into this idea of the need to retaliate, then it would spread to the next gang and it would become a never-ending cycle. With incidents like intimate partner homicide, it takes a more subtle approach. I think you see more of the parts of infectious disease with some of your group violence and some of your community violence. But I would say with incidents like the intimate partner homicides that are more expressive and individual type, less instrumental like that, we do know that a history of prior abuse, right? We know that there's a cycle of violence. We know that abusers often were victims themselves. We know that victims were previously abused or watched abuse in their home. So again, it's something that it's passed down through watching people. So it is like a disease, right? You saw it, you were exposed to it. Now it increases that likelihood.
I think that's so insightful because I had actually on here a question should we be treating gun violence like lung cancer? What does it mean to think about gun violence like lung cancer, and what's the limits of doing that? But actually, you just answered that question, which is that, maybe some gun violence we can treat it like lung cancer, but maybe other gun violence is more like a genetic disease. And maybe, there's different ways of sort of, if we unpack that insight of gun violence as an infectious disease, that doesn't actually box us in, that actually opens up a lot of different ways of imagining how this all unfolds.
Yes, and it also opens up ways for us to better understand it, because it's one of those things that's causing a lot of people to lose their lives a year. But because of the stagnation with research, we all have opinions, right? We all have anecdotes. And I think this and that generally happens in the social science. But it would be nice to permit us to study this so that we could get to underlying causes and then seeing, what are the different types of gun violence, and what are some primary prevention efforts that we can do, to use the public health term, to vaccinate everybody so that...
don't use that term. That's not going to help us in inventing the gun debate.
So I wasn't thinking about that, but it will help us understand those different contexts, because as we know, right, when we talk about gun violence and gun injuries, there's three major different ones, right? There's suicide, that has a completely different etiology than community violence per se. And then there's intimate partner violence, which is different in itself. There are different types of, if you're going to use the analogy with health, different types of cancer. You treat breast cancer different that you would treat pancreatic cancer.
Yeah. And I think what's so powerful about the public health perspective, it's reflected in just how you said that you're treating something. Nobody looks at someone who has cancer and says, you caused that. This is your fault. Let's go incarcerate you, because that's how we deal with bad people, right? So the public health perspective, I think, really shifts away from blame and tries to say, how do we create conditions so that this is less likely to happen, right? And I think that's such a powerful shift. I'm curious, so, thinking about suicide, community-embedded gun violence, thinking about intimate partner violence, where do mass shootings fit in for you with that? And one of the answers that you, just to put it on the table, if you want to say, actually, we should be talking, maybe mass shootings shouldn't be driving the conversation, that's a fair question, or fair answer too.
Yes. When people talk about mass shootings, you're thinking about these horrible incidents like school shootings and somebody going into the supermarket. But I don't think a lot of people know that the bulk of mass shootings are familicide and happen in the domestic violence context. So you have a big chunk that are part of those that fall within the intimate partner homicide framework. And then other types of mass shootings are very related to community violence. You see gang homicides, for example, fall into gang homicides with guns into mass shootings. So there are some that just defy the group, right? Some of the big tragedies that we should be talking about them separate, but there's still a lot about mass shootings that we can talk within the framework of family violence in specific, because that's where the majority of mass shootings occur.
So across your massive career and your massive CV, I tried to be how can I have a question that covers all of it? So this is one attempt at that. So you have many, many different studies looking at the determinants of and factors shaping violence. It's broad, it's nuanced. So socioeconomic opportunity, lead exposure, situational factors, neighborhood disorganization, gender, firearms law, weapon availability. And, it's overwhelming when you think about the issue of violence, where to start. And so I'm curious how you sort of have shifted your own perspective in how you think about violence from when you first started, so this is going back to thinking about this in grad school versus where you are now. And really, at what point did you start thinking about gun violence as a specific focus?
So it's interesting because I'm the new incoming president of the Society for Firearm-Related Harms. But until very recently, I never even considered myself a firearm researcher. I've always been a homicide researcher.
And can I just ask, people have different experiences going through grad school, getting trained. You obviously came up during this period where there was the CDC fund, the Dickey Amendment was in effect. And there's just this general sort of, I think, sense among scholars, like, don't study that. It's going to make your life terrible. But why? Everybody has a different explanation. Did you get any of that as you were moving through, or was it more just homicide is my thing?
Homicide was my thing.
Yeah.
And why did I get into homicide? Some of it was opportunity. I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, and I knew I wanted to do work. In my idea, I was always going to live in New Jersey. I was always going to live in Newark. I was going to stay there forever. And I wanted to do something for the community. At the time, Newark was one of the most violent and highest homicide rates in the country. So I fell into a study that then opened the door to homicide. And I was just more interested in why are people engaging in it. When I started working on homicide and thinking of dissertation ideas, I remember going to one of my mentors, Ron Clark, who's one of the originators of rational choice theory and situational crime prevention. And of course, I'm thinking poverty and all these big macro stuff. And he was like, if you want to make an impact, you should study situations, because that's what you can manipulate situations where eradicating poverty is not going to be as easy as,
I think that's the key difference between sociologists and criminologists. Yeah. We are like, well, but just eradicate poverty. Whereas you're like, well, let's think of what we can actually do.
Yeah, he was like, you could do something a little bit more, because I know you want your work to mean something else. And all that time, I am a homicide researcher. But what I tell people is that when you study homicide, when you study violence in general, you inevitably fall into gun violence research, because year after year, and in all of my data sets, over 80% of the deaths were guns. Because of that, I started working and I started talking and befriending colleagues within the University of Michigan, and I was invited to collaborate on some projects that were anti-violence, but the undertone was always firearms. So I got involved with them, and I didn't have a moment where I said I'm a firearm researcher to 2 years ago at the national conference, when people were like talking to me as if I was, and I'm like looking
as if you were one of them, and you're like, am I part of this?
Right?
Yeah.
Am I part of this? I'm like, you get like big names like Daniel Webster, and they're like talking to you and they know you. I was like, I'm probably one of them. I always try to be very respectful of not trying to say I'm something, but it didn't happen until 2 years ago. It was that realization. I am a firearm researcher, so I could say I'm a firearm researcher.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because I feel like this is a podcast about guns, and we often have gun scholars, but, we'll have people who are doing work that is so relevant to understanding the place of guns in U.S. society or, beyond. They'll really resist that label of gun scholar. They'll be like, I am not a gun scholar. And I'm like, well, everybody who does gun scholarship needs to be reading your work. So thank you for resisting. But it is interesting that like how we draw lines kind of in terms of our scholarly identities, because it is hard, I think, and of course this is my bias, to find some issue in a U.S. society, at least, that doesn't somehow touch on guns. It's really, really hard.
Yes, exactly. And, I wanted to add, too, that in terms of my perspective, so I'm a trained criminologist. I was all about punishment and all these things, because that's
all
what
about
we do.
Studying punishment.
Studying punishment. And
and maybe also, okay.
Some people, I would say there's some people that probably like to inflict punishment. But when I started venturing out because of the homicide work, and I discovered this whole idea, and I was like so ignorant to the public health approach. I was so ignorant on prevention and those things. So that also helped shift a lot of my perspective. I always knew I wanted to do work that meant something to the world. When I came into academia, I'm a first-gen student. I had no idea what a journal article meant. I didn't know. I didn't care. What I wanted to do was some work that could make a difference. And hence, when you see my broad body of work, if you see a lot of the things, it's more about that practical component, because that's what I've strived for. And then that led me to the gun world.
So I want to talk about your articulation of the importance of transdisciplinary work. And so a lot of the work that you've done, particularly on intimate partner homicide, has really, it's done a lot. One of the things that it's done is really highlight the gaps in how this phenomenon has been understood. So particularly with regard to firearms policy use and storage, you highlight how marginalized groups and rural residents have been overlooked, how there's been inadequate attention. And you I think you mentioned this already in this conversation, to the specific kinds of abuse that end up becoming relevant for predicting intimate partner homicide. What I love about your approach is that you really highlight how important understanding, firearms access, firearm policy is to this issue without reducing the issue to an issue of guns. And I think that's something that often happens, maybe not among researchers, but when that research gets translated into the political sphere, into the public conversation. And so, yeah, you have this philosophy of transdisciplinarity in this sentence from one of your papers that I'm going to read. And, basically you say, due to the multiple facets of intimate partner homicide and the complexities of the various intervention avenues, siloed approaches are not sufficient to prevent these tragedies. So can you explain what it means to approach violence from a transdisciplinary perspective?
Yes. Again, this is something that I've been striving for all of my career, but didn't get to articulate it. When we talk about the interdisciplinary perspective, is the recognition that not one discipline owns a problem. The recognition that we all have insight that we could bring to the table, and that if we work together, we could put pieces of that puzzle to better respond to it. But what I find the most engaging about transdisciplinary work is the importance of hearing the voices of those people who are affected, the importance of also bringing the perspectives of the police officers that are responding to these calls, the importance of bringing the perspectives of advocates. So it's a very holistic approach. And I usually explain it I think of a big elephant, right? And I'm like, well, maybe criminology is touching the tail and they're like, this is it. But then the sociologist is touching the big body and they'll describe the big body of the elephant in one way. And I'm like, oh, no, it's thin and little and all that. It's the same elephant. And if we work together as a group, we can then understand the big elephant and understand, well, this is how you deal with the tail, but the tail is attached to the body, and then you have to do that, and then there's the tusk or whatever, right? So this is the way I see when we're dealing with big problems. But I also think of what's the best way to eat an elephant? Piece by piece.
We're eating elephants. Okay.
We're eating elephants, right? So if you had to, it's going to look overwhelming, right? But if you start looking at the different pieces, it will make sense. And I'm also very chronological, and I like to see from the beginning to the end and see that as a whole body. With issues like gun violence, it touches so many disciplines. There's criminology with the punishment component. There's nursing and medicine. These are the first responders. There's social workers that have to deal with the aftermath of the trauma. There's sociologists that like to tell you and theorize about why it's happening in the first place. So one approach, I can't bring that to the table. I don't know anything about nursing. I don't know much about trauma-informed care as a social worker with. So I think this is the best way to approach it.
Yeah, and I really love that metaphor because I feel like even though as a vegan, I'm like, really? We have to talk about eating the elephant?
Yeah,
okay, fine.
Sorry.
That's okay. But I actually feel like that was the best part of the analogy, because we talk about, trying to get this holistic approach and trying to understand everything. And, one of the things that I appreciated, but also was like, what's going on here with the U.S. Surgeon General statement on gun violence as a public health issue? There was a lot of sociology. There was a recognition of structural factors, of racism, of the criminal justice system, not just, enacting gun policies, but also being a vector of harm that intersects with and aggravates gun violence and gun harm or gun-related harm. And so in some ways, it almost seemed like this like meta statement that was much bigger than just public health. And I think sometimes in our rush to get all of the pieces together, we don't do that last step, and the last sad step of eating the of eating the elephant, which is that we don't then go back and say, okay, how do we actually break this up? And so I think that's where there's the transdisciplinary moment where we all put ourselves in conversation with each other, but then we go back to whatever our homes are, whatever our spaces are, and say, what can I bring back concrete that's bite-sized enough that I can actually do something with it? And I think that's where there's a little tension there where keeping that disciplinary focus, not to hold on to it, but to have it be in tension with this broader picture, that's where the rubber meets the road. And that's where you can start, you're not going to eat the elephant in one bite, but you are going to slowly work it down. And I cannot believe that we are using this metaphor.
Yeah.
This
so we can we change it to an animal that's not as cute and lovely? Because nobody wants to eat an elephant. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe it should be something. Yeah, well,
something not good. Like let's just say the dinosaur or something.
A dinosaur. That's right. They're already done.
But one of the things I have to say about the transdisciplinary approach is that it's very humbling. And, I've had my moments sometimes, but you, as a scholar, you need to be willing to listen and to not think that you're always right, which is very hard for some of us, right? I myself included. I have an ego, and my first thing is like, or you're telling me about what am I doing wrong? But that's the part of the transdisciplinary approach, because it also involves constant learning, constant readjustment, constant seeing, is this working? This is not working. One of the things when my disciplinary ego starts going not on check, which could happen often, I always think of, why am I doing this for? And with the pair study, the intimate partners work that I'm doing, I always go back to I'm doing this for the children and the women. I'm doing this for the children and the women. And then my disciplinary ego goes back down and we're like, okay.
Yeah. And can you describe those studies for us?
Yeah. So the pair studies is a transdisciplinary effort. It has taken over my life for the past 5 years. It was supposed to just be 3 years, but we bit more than we could chew. It's a project that is comprised of myself, April Zioli, who's public health, Jackie Campbell, nursing, Jill Messing, social work, and Milan Abinader, who's also social work. And what we are doing is replicating the Campbell et al. 2003 femicide study at a bigger and grander scale. So the Campbell study looked at 11 cities, only looked at women. When she conducted the study, LGBT was not a thing. Nobody was collecting data on same-sex couples. And there was not a lot of information on some minoritized communities, like Native Americans, for example. So we decided to replicate the Campbell study. And instead of looking at cities, we decided to look at states. And it's called pairs for two reasons. First, because we're pairing states with each other. We wanted to get a good swath of the population to see the generalizability of things. So we paired states based on high femicide rate and low femicide rate and the stringency of gun laws and not gun laws. So we have 3 pairs. So the first pair is Arizona and New Jersey. The second pair is Texas and Maryland. And the third pair is Missouri and Oregon. And we've been collecting pretty much data on every intimate partner homicide and every intimate partner related homicide in those 6 states. And then the second reason it's called pairs is because for every case, we try to match with a control who's a survivor of domestic violence so that we can understand the risk above and beyond from just experiencing regular domestic violence and being able to get out with your life intact versus those that are not able to get out with their life intact.
So you write about how to balance effective policy solutions to gun violence without infringing on Second Amendment rights. And that balancing act, of course, is something that a certain group of justices have been thinking a lot about with respect to this case that was heard this cycle with the Supreme Court, the Rahimi case. The prohibition on gun possession for people under domestic violence restraining orders is one such solution, and this was upheld by Rahimi. So we're recording right in the days after the Rahimi decision was released. And so before we get into Rahimi, I want to just lay out the law. So can you tell us what is unique about laws surrounding intimate partner violence with respect to gun possession?
So there's two things that can happen with intimate partner violence that, according to the federal regulation, you could be barred from possessing a firearm. One of them is a conviction. You have been convicted of a felony for a domestic violence offense. And the other one is a felony or a misdemeanor offense.
A lot of people don't realize that that's a misdemeanor as well.
Yeah. So felony and misdemeanor. So these are individuals who have been determined by a court that they did commit either a felony or a misdemeanor. The other way that you can do this is through extreme protection orders. And with that, it will be temporary suspension of your Second Amendment right until when you exhibit threat. So when we think of domestic violence as almost and codified into law as something illegal, it's generally not that old, right? Where we started seeing these types of codification, it didn't fit. So in the original Rahimi decision, it didn't really fit with that historical part of it because back in those days, there wasn't a crime for it.
Yeah, and that's relevant because that's the Bruen case, right? So this
that's the Bruen case.
Yeah, so Bruen is, 2022. This is Justice Thomas's. He writes this opinion, and he is basically saying in that opinion, if you can't find, and this is what the whole debate is now with Rahimi,
analog.
Is it an analog? Is it a twin? Is it something kind of related? But lower courts, as you are saying, they were looking for something that was very similar in the historical record, and they couldn't find it.
They couldn't find it. But even though, and it's interesting because I've been talking to a historian friend of mine. He's a historian criminologist. I only know one, and he's the only one. No, you're not going to find something specific to domestic violence. But throughout history, even when the founding fathers were writing this, there were people who were considered a threat that were not allowed to have a gun. And I think what makes it more unique when we, bringing this back to domestic violence and violence against women, I guess the new thing is that these are, relatively speaking, in terms of a lot of different types of crime for violent crime, relatively speaking, this is fairly like a new thing. So I must admit that when the first Rahimi decision came out and I read it, it just was it didn't make much sense to me. Because I was like, but these are individuals that have demonstrated, proven in a court, that they are a threat. Going back to the original question about my belief in curbing the issue of gun violence without infringing on the rights of individuals, I am of the belief that firearms and guns are part of our cultural fabric. I don't think they're going anywhere, and I tell people, so I never start with, we need to get rid of guns. It's not going to happen. But what we can do, we made cars safer without getting rid of cars. There's more cars now, but they're safer. So enacting more safer measures at the primary level, things like educating people about the lethality of gun, how to properly use a gun, to respect the gun, kind of. Things like more of a secondary level, people who have shown the potential to be a threat with a gun. Maybe they shouldn't have a gun. So you could do these things without infringing on the responsible person that's doing the right thing. That I do think there's ways to do that. And then there's different things that there's more research coming out on things that you could do to possibly make them safer, or maybe some biometrics or something. So when you access your firearm. But there are ways. And what has happened is because there's so much myth and so much scare tactics is that we fail, I think as a society, have failed to see that there are solutions that don't involve taking away your gun.
Yeah, and I think, it's a failure of imagination in some ways. Like, it's a failure to see that, once we get into the political arena, we don't have to be sorting ourselves into two diametrically opposed sides, that there's actually a whole lot of ways of thinking about this issue. And I think that's really powerful. I want to talk about the political arena and sort of thinking about what it means to, engage this space, what you have to have be above and beyond research skills to have the tenacity to engage this space. And I think sometimes, thinking about like the gun debate as being such an intense political arena, I think sometimes when we talk about it as academics, we kind of have this like subtle, I don't think we explicitly say this, but there's sometimes this assumption that like, there's scary politics out there where things get crazy, and like academia is this like kind of like nice comforting space where we just talk about ideas and it's all warm and fuzzy, and that's not correct. And anyone who thinks otherwise, I would highly recommend that they read your article, The Uncivil Latina, which is amazing. It calls out all the ways that academics engage in marginalization, exclusion, for your own good policing. When you start reading it, or when I started reading it, I was like, oh, I know where this is going. And even if you know where it's going, it's shocking and disgusting, and amazing that you wrote this. So first of all, I'm basically just putting this in here as a question so that I can say you're awesome and everybody should read this. And thank you for sharing that essay with the scholarly world. And at one point at the end of the essay, you write, I learned that incivility does not necessarily have to be a bad thing. In fact, it might just be what faculty of color need to do in order to undo the status quo of a system that has oppressed so many. And I'm also wondering how that translates into the gun debate. And the reason I ask that is one of the things that has kind of emerged over the course of this first season of the podcast as sort of a sub-theme is sort of people, some people being like, I went into the field and it was the first time I experienced sexism, or like the sexism was so much worse. And then other people who are like, it was just as bad as anything I'd experienced in academia. And so it's interesting how people navigate the fieldwork world, the political world, the policy world. And so I'm wondering how you might be applying the lessons of incivility across these spaces that you engage.
When I see something that's just not fair or is just unjust, it's very hard for me to not say something. But one of the things I've learned since I've been in the firearm world is that there's ways you could say things, right? I guess my approach my whole career is, and I remember when I was an assistant professor, they would be like, oh, you can't do that. You're an assistant professor. And I'm like, but that's wrong. I can't just stay quiet. In academia, civility is deemed by just going with the status quo. Even if you're saying it in a respectful manner, the moment that you vote no on something, that you raise something that doesn't go with the status quo, you are uncivil. That article, I'm really proud of, because I feel I always joke and I say I started a movement. When I came up with this article, I had just left. I knew I wanted to write an autoethnography at some point. And in fact, I told everybody in that institution, including the provost, before I left that I was going to write something. I just told everybody. And nobody really believed me. I went to the editors of the journal and I said, we as criminologists we make a career studying of people of color, brown and black folks, because that's the way it is. But I've never seen anything from our perspective. What do you think if we do the special issue? I'm happy that they took a chance and we did the special issue. But ever since that issue came out, you see countless now autoethnography. And I try to I feel good that we started a movement so that people speak up. And when people speak up, we become more transparent. And I think it just makes the environment better, because sometimes people don't even realize that what they're doing is a microaggression. Sometimes people don't realize that what they're doing are making other people uncomfortable. So I see it as a form of educating.
Yeah, absolutely. So, also kind of pivoting or bridging that to now your role as president or president-elect of the Firearms Research Society, thinking about building spaces for mentorship, building spaces for young scholars. So, there's so many barriers or challenges that younger scholars, or I shouldn't say young, I mean emergent, so early career scholars experience just in academia in general, but then also with respect to guns, how to build a career in this area. And there's a lot of different reasons. For example, in sociology, I think there's a lot of interest in I'd like to understand that, but there's not a lot of sociologists who do guns. So if you do that, you're probably going to be the one person in your program figuring it it out. Then, of course, there's the CDC stuff and sort of this shifting narrative, but a narrative that's still kind of sticky on like, well, if you want to do that, good luck funding your research career, right? And so I'm curious, thinking about advice that you would give to emergent scholars or scholars that were doing something else but are now shifting onto this agenda of firearms scholarship. Like, what advice do you give them? What would you like them to know at the beginning of their journey?
A couple of things. We still have a lot of questions. It's an area that is ripe for future research. But I think in criminology, there's actually, unlike what many people think, there's not a lot of firearm researchers. In fact, Anthony Braga wrote a great piece that I think it was in Justice Quarterly, where he talks about like, where are the applied criminologists? It's like we've lost them all. But I think it's an area ripe for research. I would tell people that if you're going to come into the firearm world, you need to come in with an open mind. And if you want to affect policy, you need to learn how to talk to different people. If you want your work to be heard, you want your work to be liked by people in New Jersey, but you also want your work to be liked in people in Montana, right? Like polar opposite states. So, and I will also tell them that you need to be open and open-minded and talk to people, but also to the empathetic of it. I think one of the things that I'm seeing, or maybe this is just a transformation in myself that I've experienced in the past 2 years, is that I don't see this as a research thing. I see these are people's lives. These are survivors. These are, even if they're perpetrators, right? These are people that have technically lost their lives because now they're going to be in prison for the rest of their life. To bring some of that empathy into the work, because these are people. So those are the three things. There's ripe for research, open mind, learn how to, well, actually it's four things. Learn how to talk to everyone and be empathetic. And the other thing that's probably, I would say, is like get off your disciplinary high horse. Mm-hmm. But that's like...
That's just yeah. So just thinking, and yeah, we're kind of winding down. This has been such an interesting conversation. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you can share any like agenda items or any like big campaigns or things that you'll be doing with the society, but what's on your agenda for leaving your mark on this? And what's exciting is that it's a new organization, so you have a lot of power to shape its direction. Yes. So where are you going to take us?
So I ran under the platform of expanding the society and making it more inter and transdisciplinary. At this point, the society is dominated by public health and medicine. And in my campaign letter that I wrote to the executive board before they voted, one of the things that I talked about was how I want to bring other social sciences in. I want to make this a place where that people that's legal scholars feel welcome. I would like to have more criminologists, more sociologists, more social workers in play, because our work also matters and can inform a lot of the things that are happening in the public health and in the medical field. The other thing I campaigned on was on diversity and inclusion for more underrepresented faculty. I think we've done a really good job. I've been with the society since we started, and we've been very intentional into like righting the wrongs of our own disciplines and making sure we don't do these things. But I think we could be a little bit more intentional, and I talked about more recruitment and more scholarships for students in Hispanic serving institutions, for HBCUs and things like that. So that's my goal for the next 2 years once I start in January.
Well, and it's really exciting because, I think about the society primarily in terms of its conference, because that's how I interact with it generally. But now that the society, it sounds like it's going to become an officially nonprofit, yes, there's going to be some big shifts so that there's going to be programming and support and the institutional space for these kinds of initiatives, yes, much more so beyond, just a conference.
Yes. So we are working on that. We just put together a student subcommittee and student and early career subcommittee. They're exploring what are things that we can do to engage early career scholars and students so we can, who are interested in this type of work. We also are in the talks. Maybe one day we'll have our own journal on firearms and firearm injury prevention. So there's like a lot of things that we eventually want to do. We just need that legal document saying you're official.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Last question. It's summertime. That's when we're recording this. What are you reading now? What can you recommend?
So I read, I forget the title now. Oh, I Still Believe by Tiffany Evans. I met Miss Evans when I interviewed her for one of my projects. She lost her 8-year-old son in a drive-by shooting. And she came out with a book talking about the grief and how it's very personal about how do you overcome that tragedy. And when I saw that her book came out, it's not a big read. I was like, I need to read this. Again, it was one of those books that was like, this is what I do, that reminded me. That was my serious book. But right now I'm also, for fun, I decided it's summer, so I need to read fun stuff. So I started reading the Bridgerton series because that's all everybody's talking about in social media. So I wanted to see what's the big deal.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been just a really fascinating conversation. Your work is amazing, both in terms of the big questions surrounding firearms violence and intimate partner homicide, but also in terms of modeling what it means to do this kind of work from a really deeply ethical perspective. So thank you so much.
You're welcome for having me. This was fun.
Thank you for listening. This has been Guns Unpacked, and I've been your host, Jennifer Carlson, the director of the Center for the Study of Guns in Society at Arizona State University. You can learn more about our center and all we do at csgs.asu.edu. Music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. This episode was produced by Regina Ravazova.